Okay, let us get this session 2 on the way. It's on the sub-theme of it is capital flows and finance in the region. And in the session, we'll examine capital flows to the regional economies, improvements in growth and development generated by these flows, the pitfalls of dependence on these flows, and prospects for the future. I think we all know that there have been many changes in the financial landscape of the Caribbean over the last 2 decades. Canadian banks have re-entered, they've downsized, some are leaving again. Caribbean banks have merged or acquired other Caribbean banks, extended their physical presence to other Caribbean countries, and even as far away as Ghana. Changes in the international regulatory standards and framework for banking in response to concerns about money laundering and financing of terrorist activities have impacted the Caribbean banking sector in various ways, including creating the problem of de-risking and the loss of correspondent bank services. We also note that access to private international financial markets and to concessionary flows from official donors and international financial institutions by Caribbean governments has diminished. In some countries, government debt to Caribbean financial institutions and the public rose to highly problematic levels for the governments and their creditors. The patterns and flows of direct foreign investment varies geographically, sectorally, and time-wise. So what does all of this portend for the Caribbean development? We have with us in this session a panel of wise and vastly experienced economists to guide us. I will briefly introduce the panelists. We have Dr. Delal Worrell, who is joining us by Zoom. Delal Worrell is an international economic consultant and immediate past governor of the Central Bank of Barbados. He's a member of the Financial Policy Council of the Bermuda Monetary Authority and of the Bretton Woods Committee, Washington, D.C. Dr. Worrell has worked with the International Monetary Fund and served as Executive Director of the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance. He's held various research fellowships, for instance, at the Smithsonian Institution, the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., Yale University, Princeton University, the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C., and at the University of the West Indies. He's well published. Most recent publications are A New Approach to Exchange Rate Management for Small Financially Integrated Economies, which is published in the Handbook of Small Economies, and The Barbados Economy, The Road to Prosperity, published by himself. He's the author, as I said, of several other volumes and articles. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies and the McGill University, from which he obtained his PhD. I will not introduce the other panelists now. I will allow Dr. Worrell to come on board, and then when he's done, we proceed to the next panelist. Delal, over to you.
Thanks very much, Compton, and congratulations on your presentation this morning, which covered the highlights of Alister's impressive contribution and varied contribution in a very economical way. I want to first of all thank the organizers for putting on this very appropriate seminar, and by the quality of the presentations that we've had, I think that it's going to be a seminal moment in our thinking about development in the region. I want to congratulate all the presenters so far. I think that it is very important that we keep the conversations that have arisen in this encounter before our policymakers, because I think that we have begun to uncover some of the key factors for the way forward. I want to say greetings also to Arnold and Nicholas and to all my friends and colleagues and associates. who are assembled in Trinidad and who are attending the symposium. So, as I say, the theme of the symposium is very apropos, and my presentation I am calling. The title is "Rising Above the Orthodoxy of Finance." The theme of the symposium, with a subtitle of "Competitiveness is the Key to Development." My paper is an attempt to address the challenge of rising above the orthodoxy of development thinking. And one of the fundamental mistakes of orthodox thinking is the belief that development in our small economies is limited by inadequate finance. I hope to convince you that this is never the case in economies like ours. What drives economic growth and provides the resources for development are productivity gains and innovations that serve to maintain the international competitiveness of our economies. That's why the subtitle of my presentation is "Competitiveness is the Key to Development." My argument in summary is this: policies to maintain and enhance international competitiveness are key to unlocking the growth potential of small, very open economies like those of the Caribbean. The small, very open economy, that's a term that I have been using recently, specializes in the export of a small number of goods and services which it is able to produce at internationally competitive prices. With the foreign exchange earned, it buys the wide range of consumption and investment goods that a modern economy requires. The economy grows by attracting investment to increase productivity and add value to the competitive products and services produced for the international market, thereby increasing foreign earnings and the access to imported goods and services. The competitive returns offered by the export sectors attracts all the foreign and domestic finance small, very open economies need for investment. Government's development policy role is to provide efficient public services and infrastructure and ensure macroeconomic stability, both of which affect the country's competitiveness. And government also needs to provide incentives and support for private sector-led innovation and for small and medium enterprises. Investment drives growth in the small, very open economy. As investors seize opportunities to make profit in tourism, agriculture, manufacturing, services, transport, renewable energy, and other competitive activity, they create additional capacity, which promotes employment and growth. There is no limit to the international demand for Caribbean products and services that offer value for money to foreign consumers. These are the products that provide the foreign exchange on which economic growth depends. In contrast to the unlimited demand for tradable goods, the demand for government and other non-tradable services is limited to the amount of domestic income. But that does not matter, as non-tradables earn no foreign exchange, and therefore they cannot be the engines of growth in any case. There is never a shortage of finance for investments which are clearly profitable, undertaken by companies with strong balance sheets. However, it is often the case that there is insufficient finance for investment in infrastructure, health, education, public order, and other public services, which may not offer opportunities for private investors to make a competitive rate of return. These are all desirable investments that make for a competitive rate of, sorry, these are all desirable investments that impact the country's economic competitiveness. This is where fiscal policy comes to bear. Government's revenue, expenditure, and financial policies play a vital role in the growth strategy through providing the infrastructure and public services that, by their nature, cannot attract private investment. On the revenue side, fiscal policy should provide incentives for investment in foreign exchange earning activities, and taxes should be structured to have a modest redistributive effect on income. Government services should be delivered with tolerable levels of efficiency by international standards. All Caribbean members, as we have heard this morning, suffer from public services that are well below acceptable standards, and this is a serious brake on investment. Government should also provide performance-related finance and other support for small and medium enterprises and for innovations in which the private sector has first shown interest. Experience has taught us that our governments are hopeless at identifying potential for competitive new investment. Instead, government should target promising activities in which there is already serious private sector interest. Protection of the most vulnerable in society through suitable safety nets should also be a priority of government spending. The management of fiscal resources to achieve these objectives simultaneously while respecting the preferences of a substantial majority in society is a matter on which the Academy offers governments little by way of practical guidance, even though it is a central concern of actual political economy. Government has the responsibility for investment in roads, schools, sanitation, hospitals, and other public infrastructure that by its nature cannot offer an attractive rate of return to the private investor. In the paper that I have distributed to accompany this session, I expand on that point. For reasons of time, I will not speak further on that. I'll move on to the financing of government expenditures, matters for competitiveness and investment, because it may affect foreign reserves and the stability of the exchange rate. An exchange rate which is subject to capricious changes is a major deterrent to investors because of the resulting uncertainty of wages and prices. Expected returns on investment become less predictable, and returns to domestic investment become less attractive compared to what may be available in competing markets. My next point is that all investment in the small, very open economy requires foreign finance. All investment in countries as small as those in the Caribbean requires finance in foreign currency to purchase equipment, vehicles, materials, fuels, and other inputs from abroad for each new project. This is true whether the project is large or small, private or public, for domestic production or export. It follows that all investment of necessity requires a substantial proportion of foreign finance. The implications of this obvious circumstance are not well understood. Everyone laments the low domestic savings ratios in the Caribbean, and we hear regular exhortations to increase domestic savings, supposedly in order to stimulate growth. However, domestic savings are in local currency. In order to do any investment, the saver has to acquire foreign currency in addition to or in exchange for their savings, because their domestic currency cannot be used to pay for the imports they need. On the other hand, foreign currency can be used to buy domestic goods and services if domestic savings are in short supply. It follows that there can never be a shortage of finance for competitive investment in the small, very open economy. If local savings are insufficient, foreign financiers are happy to step in to take advantage of the competitive rate of return on offer. Equally, domestic entrepreneurs who are well established and of good standing never have a difficulty in securing foreign funding to cover the imports needed for their investments. It is the competitiveness of investment projects, not the supply of domestic finance, which limits the rate of investment in well-established areas of activity. There are, however, important areas that banks and financial institutions will not fully take care of, and where government policy intervention is needed. These include innovative product projects, investment in public goods, and small and medium enterprises. And I have a substantial section of the paper which deals in turn with each of these and the appropriate government policies. But again, in the interest of time, I skip over that and I go directly to the question of growth promoting strategies for Caribbean governments. The most important growth inducing strategy needed of Caribbean governments is the modernization of the public service to achieve internationally accepted levels of efficiency. Our benchmarks should be small economies that are in the highest category of development in the annual Human Development Report. Countries such as Ireland, Iceland, Singapore, Luxembourg, Malta, and Cyprus. The failure of repeated attempts to reform the public sectors to date teaches us that the Caribbean and the international institutions we have hitherto depended on for help in this regard lack the knowledge, experience, and capacity to guide our governments towards successful implementation of the change that is needed. Our governments must seek relevant expertise from the world's leading international consultants, choosing those who have experience with small countries with very high human development, such as those we have just mentioned. The extent of reform required will necessitate a medium-term action plan for implementation, with performance criteria related to the elements of the two best publications that we have for guidance in this regard, which are the World Bank's Doing Business Report and the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report. The reform will result in a much smaller number of employees in the public sector. Public servants will be more highly skilled and better paid, particularly in the higher levels of expertise. At the top of the public service, there should be a handful of officers of international standing whose remuneration must be adequate to recruit the caliber of person needed to build and maintain the credibility of the new efficient public service. The process of converting our current under-resourced, ineffective, and largely demoralized public service into one that compares favorably with Ireland, Iceland, and Singapore will need to be carefully prepared for, managed, and financed to ensure that livelihoods are not destroyed in the process. The reformed public sector will stimulate growth by addressing the critical factors identified in this essay. improving health, education, public order, public administration, and other public services that feature in the Doing Business and Global Competitiveness reports. Devising roadmaps and action plans with deadlines for renewables and the Caribbean regional cultural industry in close collaboration with stakeholders. In the part of the essay that I don't talk about, I speak to the regional cultural industry, and if I can perhaps elaborate on that in the question time. Fortifying the international reputation of the Caribbean brand in tourism, rum, international services, and other areas where the region has a strong competitive position, working in collaboration with regional private sector organizations to eliminate regional frictions and redundancies, about which we heard a great deal from Mr. Guantun this morning. Also, government should support innovation with incentives and targeted finance, which is performance related, using regional and international networks to ensure access to skills and markets. And here I think the contribution that Dylan made this morning is very appropriate. And finally, providing support and finance to small and medium enterprises, and I think it's important to do that through the agency of non-government organizations, rather than directly by the government, where it stands, where our experience has been of too much political capture. In addition, governments should ensure a favorable climate for investment by maintaining a small surplus on the fiscal current account. All borrowing in local and foreign currency should be devoted to expenditure which adds to the national wealth, capital expenditure. In this way, there will be no borrowing from the central bank to create new spending and imports, no excessive foreign reserve loss, and no rumors of devaluation to act as a disincentive to investors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilal, for a very interesting, very succinct presentation. I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss when we get to that stage of the proceedings. The next presenter is Elvia Veloso. She will speak on the subject of capital flows, sovereign ratings, and financing gaps in the Caribbean. Ms. Veloso is Economic Affairs Officer at the Washington, D.C. office of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. She works in a variety of areas, including access to external financing and financial flows to the region, with a focus on development and green financing. And she also works on macroeconomic and policy analysis of the U.S. economy. Her previous positions include consultant to the Organization of American States Trade Unit and economist at the Customs Policy Commission of Brazil's Ministry of Finance. Ms. Veloso, a national of Brazil, earned an MA in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in economics from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Ms. Veloso.
First of all, thank you very much to the Institute of International Relations for this invitation. And a special thanks to Professor Winston Dukran, who spent a year with our office in Washington, D.C., our ECLAC office. And actually, we are in his debt for how much we learned about the Caribbean region during this year. My presentation actually is based on the work that we did together while he was there, and that the office has been focusing on since then. So my presentation is going to be divided in 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about the recent trends in capital flows to the Caribbean. Then in the second part, I'm going to focus more specifically in the access to international debt markets, borrowing abroad. And the third part, I'm going to talk about possible strategies for mobilizing resources towards sustainable development. So the objective of the presentation now, I hope it's going to be a complement to the discussions this morning and the previous presentation, is to look at options to finance this effort, to achieve sustainable development, given the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. So let's start with the trends in capital flows to the region. And the first major trend that we see is a decline in official flows. I think if you look at the chart, there is a peak of official development assistance net flows to the Caribbean in 1990, and since then you see a downward trend. In 2017, it represented only 1.3% of the gross national income of the Caribbean region, which is lower than the 3% average in the 2000s and the 4.3% average for the period that we analyzed from 1980 to 2017. So the counterpart of that is that you see an increased importance in private capital flows to the region. In the case of the Caribbean, since the 1990s, foreign direct investment flows and remittances flows became the main two sources of external financing to the region. So if we look at they have remained so far as the top sources. If we look at the chart, we'll see that the dark green curve is foreign direct investment, and we see an upward trend up until 2008. Then we have the global financial crisis, and it has a significant impact on those flows. We will have a decline and more volatility. You see a little bit of recovery, but the impact was very big, but it's a major source of external funding. The second line that we have is the orange line, is remittances, and remittances became very important also as a source of funding, but a lot less volatile than the other private sources. And actually, in 2017, was the main source. It was more important than FDI flows in that year. Actually, since 2011, they overtook foreign direct investment as the main source of external funding. And it has a little bit to do with the end of the commodity cycle, and then you start to receive less investments, and also the results of the global financial crisis. And finally, the third component of those private flows that you see also in the chart is the mustard line. It's private. Private portfolio investment, and the definition those are cross-border transactions in equity and debt securities, and they are a lot more volatile. Their share is a lot lower than the other two sources, and actually you see more outflows than inflows during the period. The negative, when you see negative, sign is because it's outflows. But since 2014, following a series of debt restructurings in the region, we start to see an increase in inflows of those flows, portfolio investment. So let's talk about the top sources of private financial flows, FDI and remittances. They are actually quite significant relative to the size of the economies in the region. In the chart also, we look at the FDI inflows by country as a percentage of GDP for a 10-year period from 2007 to 2017. And what you can see is that for most countries in the Caribbean, it exceeds 6% of GDP. This means that they are susceptible to changes in fluctuations in those flows, and that's precisely what happened after the global financial crisis. Remittances are also very significant for the region. In some countries, they actually represent more than 10% of GDP. But there is a slight difference between remittances and FDI inflows. While the FDI inflows, they come in order to increase the country's capital stock and productivity, remittances are heavily skewed towards consumption, household consumption. And we are going to talk a little bit about that later. So the challenge going forward when we look at those trends is how find a way to mobilize and channel those private capital flows towards economic development objectives. Because usually private flows, they have their own logic, they come in search of yields and profitability. So how to find a way to channel them to the right, the right objectives for the region. Oops. So this takes us to the second part of the presentation, that actually I'm going to focus on the third component of the private flows, which is the net portfolio investment, more specifically the access to international debt markets. And even though it's a small share of the total, I think with an increasing cooperation and also with some innovative instruments, they could be a part of this mobilization of resources for sustainable development. So let's look at the access of the Caribbean region to international debt markets since 2000. The first thing that you're going to notice after we go through the slides is that this access is more limited and it's more costly for the Caribbean countries than it is for some of the larger economies in the Latin America, Caribbean region as a whole. And it has to do with their small size, which implies a narrow range of activities. You have also smaller economies of scale, and also the vulnerability to external shocks and to economic shocks, natural disasters, all that impair access. So when we see how much they borrowed abroad, we look at this chart. This is the percentage of issuance from both sovereign and corporate issuers from the Caribbean as a percentage of the total in the Latin American and Caribbean. And we see that this percentage usually is small. It's not big at all. On average, it's close to between 2 and 3%. In some years, even lower than 1%, like in 2018 and the first half of 2019. Only 2007, when we look there, is an outlier. And that was because there were two very significant issuances that year. One by the Petroleum Company of Trinidad and Tobago, which issued a 750 million bond, and another by Digicel Group, which issued a 1.4 billion bond. So that year, the share of the Caribbean issuers in the total went all the way to 8%, 8.2, 25%. So looking at the whole period, we have a total of the total amount that was issued, or the total amount that was borrowed abroad was 33.2 billion. It represented only 2.3% of the Latin America Caribbean region's total. Only 7 Caribbean countries actually tapped international debt markets in this period. And the top 3 issuers in the region were Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Bahamas. But when we look at Jamaica, Jamaica accounts for almost 60% of the total, followed by Trinidad and Tobago with 23%, I think. No? So one of the major trends for the Latin American and Caribbean in the past 15 years was a shift in external funding from sovereign to corporate borrowing. And in the Caribbean, this trend also held, so they mirror that trend. So what we show in this chart is basically that from 2000 to 2004, the green bars are sovereign issues. You just have sovereign issues. You don't see any corporate issues. From then on, you start to see a lot more corporate issues. That is the gray bar. And in some years, you see only companies accessing international markets and not the countries themselves. So what kind of corporate issues you see? So you have companies based only in 4 Caribbean countries that are accessing international debt markets. And those countries are Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and the Bahamas. Those companies in general, they are transnational companies or state-owned, but state-owned companies are responsible just for about 1/3 of the total. And more than 90% of the corporate Caribbean issuances took place in two sectors, in telecommunications, and I think this is basically because of Digicel Group, and in energy. So we saw how much was borrowed abroad. And then what I wanted to look at as well is the terms in which they can borrow from international debt markets. And for that, we look at spreads, debt spreads. We're going to look at the JP Morgan EMBI global spreads, which measures country risks and spreads. And we are looking here, my whole presentation, we're looking about at regional average. No, we are not looking at individual countries. So we have those two lines. The dark line is the Latin average, the Latin index, and the light green line is the average for the Caribbean. And what we notice here is that actually right after the global financial crisis, you see a huge gap between the two averages because it became a lot more expensive for the Caribbean countries and Caribbean issuers in general, both corporate and sovereign, to access international debt markets. This held up until the end of 2014 when this gap was closed, and then you see that the averages now are more or less similar. When you look at the individual countries, for example, both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago have actually spreads that are lower than the Latin average. So in terms of accessing international markets, it's not as expensive as it was right after the global financial crisis. And finally, we look also at the evolution of credit ratings in the region, because if the credit quality is high, it's easier for you to borrow abroad. And what we notice here, also looking into the averages, is that the credit quality in the Caribbean region, it started at a better point in the mid-90s, in 1996. You had a better credit quality, and then you see a downward trend since then. On the other hand, you see an improvement in credit quality starting in 2003 for the hemisphere, or for the region as a whole. If we look at the three sub-regional countries, we see that most of this improvement in credit quality was actually due to South America plus Mexico. You know, the Caribbean has continued, the credit quality has continued to deteriorate. And I think it has to do with many of the issues that were raised earlier this morning. You have high debt, it's a region with a lot of debt, some very important structural problems that were reflected in this decline in credit ratings. So given those trends, those very, overall trends in terms of access to external financing, what strategies we could use to mobilize resources in order to divert resources to development. So the idea is to think about long-term strategies for long-term problems. And then we need a set of not only ideas, but also new initiatives and also new financial instruments as well. One idea, for example, is linking debt resolution to resilience measures. ECLAC's debt for climate adaptation swaps is one of those initiatives. You would have the countries exchange a reduction in debt for investment in climate adaptation, and this initiative also envision Caribbean Resilience Fund for the region. Other possible strategies is to create financial buffers for small economies, and this would be through new instruments such as green bonds that are used to raise money for sustainable projects. For example, diaspora bonds, that's fixed income bonds that you offer to a migrant population abroad at preferential rates, and blue bonds, also similar to green bonds, an instrument for you to raise resources to finance sustainable oceans and fisheries. So let's look at each of them, and starting with the green bonds. Green bonds are actually on the rise in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the region. And the first green bond was issued in December 2014 by a Peruvian company. And since then, until July 2019, you issued a total of 23 billion of green bonds, both in local and international markets. But 75% of this total actually was placed in international bond markets. To get an idea of magnitude, the annual average of green bonds in the total international debt issuance from the region this period is only 3.3%. But if you can see the table, I don't know if you can see the numbers there, that share was on an increasing upward trend up until 2017. In 2017, actually, the share raised to almost 6%. Then in 2018, it was a year of volatility in global financial markets. The share dropped to less than 1%. But in the first half of 2019, we've seen a lot more issuances, green issuances in the region, including the first sovereign issuance in the region that was by Chile this past June. In terms of the Caribbean participation in this green issuance, it's very minimal. But in June 2019, we saw a company, Williams Caribbean Capital, incorporated in Barbados, issuing a green bond and this to finance a solar energy project. And this was actually certified by the Climate Bond Initiative as a real green investment and issuance. And I think it's an example to keep following, because maybe other companies in the region could follow suit and replicate the same experience. Diaspora bonds. We saw this morning the discussion about remittances, and that sometimes they didn't help the countries as much. Or in terms of the diaspora bonds, I think it's a way for you to tap on those resources that are very significant. So a lot of countries now, they want to find a way, because usually they come to towards household consumption, but they want to find a way to divert part of those resources to private, productive investment. So those bonds would be a way to do that, offer bonds to the migrants abroad, so that they, at preferential rates, so that you can actually tap on their savings and finance some projects in the region. The international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks, they could help in this effort. And actually, I think the World Bank said that they have received several requests from several countries to do this, just that, to devise diaspora bonds with them. And finally, we have the blue bonds. You know, sustainable oceans is also one of the sustainable development goals, not only the environment. And you also need solutions and innovative solutions to find a way to finance, you know, fisheries in a sustainable way. Last year, the Republic of Seychelles launched the first sovereign blue bond, and they raised a total of 15 million to advance their blue economy. The World Bank actually helped them design this bond. Oops. So to conclude, I talked a little bit about the trends and about those instruments, and the idea is that we need this increase in efforts to find other sources of resources to finance sustainable development. But nothing is going to work if you don't have a collaborative effort. So you need all hands on deck, you need the collaboration among Caribbean states, you need collaboration with multilateral institutions, and also international development partners and the private sector. So only with this collaborative effort, you will be able, the region will be able to implement the 2030 agenda and finally achieve, find an answer to their development challenges. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Veloso. We turn to the third presentation on the topic of an optimal strategy for financing growth in the Caribbean. Presenter is Dr. Dave Siratan, who is an economist studying Caribbean and emerging economies for over 20 years, particularly the financial sector in these economies. He's researched and published in areas such as financial innovations, financial regulations, financial market microstructure, global foreign exchange markets, mutual fund performance, fiscal reforms, business strategy, and competitiveness, and has consulted in a variety of ways on topics in the financial sector and business competitiveness, good business competitiveness, and the fiscal and debt sustainability. He now teaches international money and finance at the graduate level in the Institute of International Relations and coordinates the MSc Global Studies program there. He at one time headed the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance between 2015 and 2017, served as editor of the Journal of Business, Finance and Economics in Emerging Economies, and has been a member of the Regional Financial Stability Coordination Council, a committee created by Caribbean central banks to coordinate work on developing the regional architecture for financial stability. He is also served as a member of the Trinidad and Tobago government cabinet appointed and other Caribbean-wide committees on the financial sector. It gives me pleasure to invite Dr. Siratan to address you.
A pleasant good afternoon to everyone. I am apologizing in advance because I'm struggling with a cold, so I have some issues every now and again with clearing my throat. So. My presentation today, as Professor Bourne indicated, focuses on what is the optimal strategy that Caribbean countries could utilize to maximize growth in the context of all the economic vulnerabilities and the structural weaknesses that Arnold McIntyre outlined so comprehensively this morning for us. Helvia also outlined in great detail the development financing landscape in the Caribbean in her presentation, and as luck would have it, two of the first bullet points deals with the main development challenges in the Caribbean and the development financing landscape in the Caribbean. So I am not going to focus on those things too much, since Arnold and Helvia has basically covered those two areas in particular, which allows me to focus a little more on the last two bullet points, which is really the meat of the matter in terms of my presentation. The reason for looking at the main development challenges in the Caribbean and the development financial landscape is that it offers us a window into the workings of development financing in the Caribbean, and it highlights the kinds of mistakes we have made in the past and the consequences of those mistakes for growth in the Caribbean. And it also highlights the fact that if you have structural weaknesses and macroeconomic imbalances, if you make mistakes as well on the development financing front, that reinforces those vulnerabilities and makes the situation much worse, right? So that was the logic of those two sections. I'm not going to go into the main development challenges in the Caribbean, only to make the point that these vulnerabilities are not mutually exclusive, which means that they tend to reinforce each other. So the point I was trying to make about development financing mistakes reinforces these vulnerabilities is that it has the same dynamic. If you already have pre-existing weaknesses, structural weaknesses, and that is combined with that generates certain types of macroeconomic vulnerabilities, and then you make mistakes on development financing front, in particular not controlling as carefully as you should have your debt financing instruments, then you're going to end up in a much worse position that you started off with. The other point that I wanted to make is that given the ambitious targets we have for our developmental goals, as outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals, Caribbean countries have must generate higher levels of growth than you would find in developed market economies. So the US growing at 3% per annum is a pretty robust rate of growth for developed market economies. But that rate of growth doesn't really do it for small developing countries who are by definition behind the game, and there's a development gap which they need to narrow. And the only way they could do that is by growing pretty strongly relative to the developed market economies. So the target for growth, in order for the Caribbean to meet its development goals, has to be a pretty ambitious level of growth. And if you look at the growth trajectory in the Caribbean over the last 40 years, there's a very worrying development, and I will jump to that table now. This is basically a table that looks at the average per capita GDP growth in CARIFORUM member countries over the period 1960 to 2016. This is a table that is lifted from one of a paper I did in 2016. And what it shows is that if you look, I don't know if this, I have to point. If you look at Caribbean here, you will see that in the 1960s and the 1970s, we did pretty well. We did much better than Latin America, the overall region, Latin America and the Caribbean. But from the 1980s onwards, growth has consistently declined. And more important for for the future of the region is the last line here, which shows the growth gap between the Caribbean and some of the more efficient developing countries in the world. And you will see that in the 60s, we were basically ahead of these economies, and over time they have caught up and surpassed us significantly. Okay, so it means that not only at the level of aggregate growth we are performing much worse than we did in the 60s. It also means that relative to countries that we compete with, the most efficient one that is, we are falling further and further behind, right? Because as you know, competitiveness is not only an absolute measure, but also it's relative. You have to benchmark your performance relative to other countries who you may compete with. Some of the interesting thing about this development in terms of the low growth, high debt dynamic that Arnold mentioned this morning is the fact that Caribbean growth tends to be driven more by consumption and less by net export and investments, as they are in some of the more dynamic economies in Asia. Okay, so there's a definite difference between the growth poles in the Caribbean and those in Asia. Of course, we have to deal with the fundamental problems of volatility related to natural disasters, as per Hurricane Dorian and the impact it has had on the Bahamas. And it is very difficult for any country in a zone like the Caribbean to have to deal with hurricanes every 3 or 4 years. It is very difficult for any country, more or less small, open developing countries, to deal with that kind of shock and still post very reasonable rates of growth and so on, right? So our structural problems with respect to geography is a significant hurdle to overcome, but there are similar economies who are similarly affected who have managed to have overcome those hurdles. So it means that we can, in some form or fashion, overcome those as well. There's also a serious problems with low productivity, as Arnold indicated earlier this morning. Some of the reasons for those low productivity increase involves increases in unproductive public investments, and I'm sure many of us in the Caribbean could identify specific examples of unproductive public investments. Large investments in low productivity agricultural sector, and of course the dominance of maturing sectors such as traditional sun and and C, tourism. Okay, so these problems over time, of course, all work together to create that dynamic of low growth and high debt. I'm not going to go over these things because this is basically just emphasizing the points that Elvia made. The only point I want to make about the development financing landscape, which Helvia made as well, is the dominance of private sources of capital. And in particular, in some countries, because of the makeup of those countries, the heavy dependence on external sources of capital. Now, some people may argue that the fact that small open economies can attract foreign finance is an indication that the region is relatively robust and strong. But if you are too dependent on foreign sources of capital, it could potentially be a source of vulnerability because, as we found out in 2007, 2008, when the international financial markets go into meltdown, and there's a lot of risk aversion in those financial markets, the first thing to do is that investors run to so-called safer harbors, and developed countries are viewed, probably incorrectly so, as in many cases, as those safe harbors. So what happened in the aftermath of 2007 was that capital basically fled from developing countries back to safer havens in the developed market economies. And those countries that were heavily dependent on external sources of capital, of course, suffered greatly relative to those who was not so similarly dependent. So I'm just going to go over some of the challenges, the pros and cons of the different financing instruments that we have in the Caribbean. As Helvia mentioned, the main sources of external finance in particular is foreign direct investment, remittances, and of course, bringing up the rare official development assistance. And as she so pointedly indicated in her first chart, the ODA, official development assistance to the region, has declined significantly. So the implications for that is that we can no longer depend on some of these flows, and that source of financing is basically targeted now at very low income countries. And in the region, I think the only country that will qualify for some of these funds is Haiti. Right, but the majority of our countries are middle income country, and by definition, using the income criterion, we will not qualify for some of these funds. The other problem with FDI, I'm just talking about the problems that Helvia kind of went into some of the advantages. Another problem with FDI is that it is concentrated in a few sectors. So in Trinidad and Tobago, it's in the energy sector. In the Bahamas, it will be in tourism, etc., etc. And we already know one of the structural weakness of these economies is the highly concentrated nature of their economies. So we depend on we depend for our export revenues on 1 or 2 or 3 sectors at most in many countries in the Caribbean. And if you have a situation where a dominant financing instrument like foreign direct investment goes mainly to those dominant sector, it is going to predispose the country to maintain in that very narrow economic structure that we have already recognized as one of our structural weaknesses. So in many respects, the pattern of FDI deployment in the Caribbean kind of accentuates our problems with respect to a lack of diversification. So that's an issue you have to think about when you're thinking about the optimal financing strategy. The sectors targeted by FDI and the policy frameworks for these flows are also critically important if these flows are to drive a sustainable improvement in growth. So for example, Price Mart, which you all Trinidadians should know, Price Mart is a form of foreign direct investment, but it is in the consumption sector, and therefore there is likely to be a net outflow of foreign exchange from that particular investment. And we already know that we have a binding foreign exchange constraint in the country. So by definition, you want FDI to be encouraged into the tradable sectors where you can actually earn foreign exchange on these inflows. The policy framework is also important because the policy framework you could incentivize, if you have a properly structured FDI framework, incentivize FDI inflows into particular sectors that you may want to promote and those kinds of things. So the design of your investment framework for foreign capital is very, very important in terms of your overall development impact of FDI flows. Now, the foreign exchange constraint, as we said, in the Caribbean is binding, and Delisle Worrell, who spoke first, always makes that point. And so FDI must generate positive effect foreign exchange flows to foster resilience. And there's a lot of evidence. There's some evidence in Helvia's paper, as well as in the UN Global Economic Performance Report in 2010, which demonstrates that there may in fact be a net outflow, foreign exchange outflow, when you take into account net interest outflows and investment income payments abroad. Okay, this of course does not include any foreign exchange flows or export earnings that might actually be attributed to this thing. So this is an imperfect measure, but the figures, when one looks at it, is quite stark in terms of the fact that net foreign exchange flows from some of these major development finance instruments like FDI in the Caribbean, in some countries in the Caribbean, is actually negative. FDI is also associated with overly generous tax concession, which further weakens tax buoyancy in many jurisdictions. I think Arnold, over the years, have spoken ad nauseum about the fact that tax incentives don't work. It only really leads to a net loss of tax revenues. But when you speak to business people, they will argue until the cows come home that tax incentives are very, very critical to their competitiveness and their ability to. So there is a dichotomy between the position of economists and business people. I'm sorry Mr. Gantum is not here today. That might be a good question to ask him. The other major form of development financing, of course, in the Caribbean is remittances. I think Helvia pointed out, and I think Arnold this morning as well, that Jamaica in particular, remittances is a particularly large component of net of foreign capital, and this is something that is good, but as Helvia, I think, indicated in a paper, there are some downsides to remittances. One of the main ones, of course, is that they tend to be used mainly for consumption purposes. So therefore, there's not a large investment component associated with these flows. Jamaica and Suriname, Guyana, Haiti, and Suriname have also benefited from significant flows in regions. Countries have attempted to increase these flows by developing policy frameworks to facilitate these flows by encouraging more dealers who actually facilitate these flows. The problem with these things, as Arnold mentioned, one is that migration of national abroad sometimes leads to negative effects such as the brain drain, which he mentioned. And based on some research done by some of his fund colleagues, I think it's Beaton et al. In 2017, they indicated a net effect of migration when one takes into account the positive impact of remittances and the negative impact of brain drain, is that there may be a net negative impact of remittances on growth in the region. Of course, when one considers issues like FATCA and AML and CFT regulations, which have increased the cost of doing business in this area in terms of remittances and so on, this could potentially lead to a drying up of these flows, which is going to create significant problems for the countries who are dependent on them. And a significant amount of diplomatic and policy work has been done and is ongoing to address these challenges. So the Caribbean as a region has made contact with the fund, and in the various international fora, they're trying to argue the case that these regulations and standards create all kinds of existential problems for their economies. Right? I think Helvia went over this, so I'm not going to go over this anymore. One of the development financing option that we don't talk a lot about is, or at least again, because I remember when I was a young graduate student, there was a lot of talk about financial development and policies to develop your financial system and those kinds of things, but you don't hear much of that anymore. But domestic resource mobilization is part of the development financing arena and is more often than not one of the largest components of the development financing equation. And it is something that we need to revisit in terms of seeing how what role this can play in the development financing strategy that countries in the Caribbean can adopt. And when we talk about domestic resource mobilization, we're basically talking about domestic mobilization of public funds, which deals with efficient tax systems and expenditure efficiency, which we discussed earlier, but it also talks about domestic capital market and financial institution development. Because the argument is if you can develop the financial system, then a lot more of your surplus funds that you use for investment can be actually generated in-house. And very importantly, it reduces your reliance on external capital, a critical vulnerability in some countries where they are overly dependent on external finance. Success in this area also helps. There are studies that have shown that success in this area improves your credit rating, so you can get better terms on your external financing transactions. And there are a range of other positive externalities derived from better outcomes in this area. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into those details. And for best results, external financing should really be viewed as a complement to and not a substitute for domestic resource mobilization. Delisle has a slightly different view because he argues that based on the binding foreign exchange constraint that we have in the region, the important thing is really how much hard currency you have. The last two slides basically looks at how to approach the development financing dilemma to ensure that you get the best bang for your buck in terms of growth. Okay, so a general point is that different forms of development financing have different advantages and risk factors, as we went over. The different forms should be viewed as a menu of options that forms part of a current whole. So for each individual country in the Caribbean, of course, based on their situation, based on pre-existing vulnerabilities, you have a different option or a different combination of financing options might actually be better for you relative to another country. So for example, if you are a country that is heavily indebted, using debt instruments to meet your development financing needs probably is not the best way to go. Okay, that's a kind of Caribbean countries' development financing strategy should also always be viewed through the lens of two competing and often conflicting objectives. This is something that was touched on earlier today. And that is to provide sufficient public financing for more philanthropic expenditures in pursuit of a variety of sustainable development goals, while at the same time ensuring the adequacy of long-term finance to drive robust sustainable growth, which is the most effective way of reducing poverty and dealing with debt sustainability in the long run, right? one of the problem with meeting those two objectives is that they often conflict. So, for example, aid can induce dependency and slower growth, as have been shown in some areas when you look at the impact of aid on developing countries, right? An appreciation for this level of interconnectedness is important to achieve both your efficiency and equity objectives. A key factor is getting the right balance. In getting the right balance is to deploy different development financing options to achieve different objectives, right? Better domestic resource mobilization should be the main foundation of the optimal development financing strategy, both on the equity and efficiency front of and we could discuss, I'm happy to field questions as to why this may be so. Ideally, public domestically mobilized funds should be the base to achieve objectives such as social inclusion, and this should be augmented by concessionary ODA, while the domestic private financial sector, FDI, and other private sources of capital should be targeted at economic efficiency. Right? And this is so because the incentive structures of these different financing instruments, and they have attributes of these forms, are focused on particular private risk return trade-off, and this is why you have this particular kind of deployment strategy. There is also wide-ranging consensus that financial sector deepening is an important part of the overall development agenda, but less is known about the exact channels and mechanisms. So we need to do a little more work in terms of trying to get a more granular understanding of how financial development help move us up the supply chain in terms of development and gives us more robust economic growth. We also don't know a lot about which policies, institutions, and interventions is best at different stages of economic and financial development, and how to avoid financial fragility, because as we have seen, countries that were the most developed financially actually fared the worst in the recent international financial crisis. So there's no such thing as an unambiguously ever increasing development of the financial sector. There is a limit to which this process is actually useful. I'm not going to go over the last two bullets. I want to end by looking at some of the recommendations, because after all, this symposium was supposed to come up with some out-of-the-box recommendations as to how we could get past some of the hurdles that we face. And some of the things that I would want to recommend to policymakers in the region is that there is evidence there are certain thresholds for debt beyond which there is no further increases in growth related to more debt. So, for example, Kevin Greenish et al., who is at the fund now, had a paper in 2016, I believe, where he demonstrated the average threshold for the for Caribbean countries was about 55% of GDP, which meant that on average, once your debt got beyond that threshold, you are likely to have no further increases in growth from taking on more and more debt, and it might actually cause growth to turn to generate negative growth to decline. Sorry, it is not, and obviously different Caribbean countries. This is the average for the region, but different Caribbean countries, depending on their situation and their vulnerabilities and so on, will have different thresholds. Some might be higher, some might be lower. A lot of the countries were actually, they had thresholds that were about I think Trinidad and Tobago threshold was about 75%, right? So there is an understanding that if you increase debt beyond a certain point, it is not going to help you, right? You also, since ODA from traditional sources, the figure that Helvia showed was basically ODA from the traditional sources, and since ODA from those traditional sources are likely to fall, there is a lot of work that has been done looking at what kinds of non-traditional sources of ODA one can tap in, and Helvia would have mentioned a lot of these options, but there are also sources such as charitable foundations, such as the Bill Gates and Ford Foundations, as well as social impact investors, such as the Shell Foundation and the Acumen Fund. And of course, private sources of development finance are now dominant, with many countries, which means that many countries have called into question the roles of multilateral development bank, and Ian is going to be speaking about that in the next presentation. But there have been recommendations where multilateral development banks may need to transform to work together with private finance to mobilize capital for development. This so-called crowding in of the private sector, where the development banks, multilateral development banks, work very closely with the private sector, not only to raise capital, but also to fund investment in particular areas. Of course, that will require a radical transformation of the multilateral development banks. There's no generally good financing option for, the other thing is on the issue of small and medium-sized enterprises. If you look across the Caribbean, you tend to have very large corporations tend to have relatively good financing options. The World Bank and other multilateral agencies have also done some work trying to find ways of funding some of the most vulnerable individuals. But in the SME sector, the small and medium-sized enterprises, we are still behind the ball, behind the curve, so to speak, in terms of ensuring that is adequate development finance for this class of institution. And the reason why this is important is because in developed market economies, 57% of employment is basically generated by these SMEs. In the Caribbean and in other developing countries, the figure is about 19%, which means that if we could get some traction in this area to improve financing of SMEs, that we could have similarly beneficial developments in terms of employment and growth and so on. And I thank you and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Dave. Lots of points of tangency with earlier presentations and some points of divergence. We turn now to the final presentation by Ian Durant on the topic of closing the infrastructure gap, the role of MDBs. Ian is currently Deputy Director of the Economics Department of the Caribbean Development Bank and was previously an economist in the bank. He has done research on debt sustainability and debt restructuring and has worked on policy-based loans for Caribbean countries that involved debt restructuring. Prior to joining the Caribbean Development Bank, he worked in the research department of the Central Bank of Barbados. He also worked at the Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center, CARTAC, as macroeconomic advisor, where he managed technical assistance and capacity building in the area of macroeconomic programming and policy. He holds a BSc from the University of the West Indies, from the KVL campus, and an MSc from the University of Birmingham in the UK. Ian, over to you.
Here. Good afternoon, folks. First of all, let me congratulate the IIR on organizing what I deem to be a very important and timely symposium. And I want to thank you for inviting us. So I've been slotted in as the number 11 batsman. I don't know if I'm going to be able to maintain the traditions of playing a few unorthodox shots and making a quick exit, but we'll see. Right, so what I'm going to do, well, the intention really is to talk about closing the infrastructure gap and the role of MDBs in so doing. But what I'm going to do first is that I'm going to talk a little bit about the development context. And in a sense, there's going to be some overlap between this and what has been covered over the past few hours. So I'm going to try to be parsimonious. I may slip over some slides and so on. But then I'm going to talk about the role of infrastructure in the development process. You know, share some, I guess, some theoretical and empirical ideas. And I'm going to talk about the role of MDBs in helping to close these gaps. So, as we at the Caribbean Development Bank see it, some of the critical development challenges confronting the region include, in no particular order, high poverty clustered largely between 20% and 45% of the population for most countries, with a few exceptions. On the lower side, you have countries like Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. On the higher side, you have countries like, well, specifically, you have Haiti. And when I talk, I'm making reference mostly to what we refer to as our boring member countries. So it includes the British Overseas Territories as well as, you know, the independent countries. So if you hear me make reference to that term BMC, that's the group about which I'm speaking. But you also have other phenomena like high youth unemployment, high crime rates that pretty much create a drag on growth, climate change and natural disasters, small markets, I think we talked a little bit about this, and the inability of countries on their own to exploit economies of scale. Low growth, this was mentioned quite a few times. High migration, a few years ago the IDB did a study that included a stat that I found was startling, suggesting that about 70% of our labor force with tertiary training migrate to OECD countries. So that is certainly something that we should all be concerned about, and creating opportunities for those highly educated individuals on which tremendous amounts of resources have been expended in training so that they can develop our countries. And of course, the notion of high public indebtedness. So these are some of the critical issues that I wanted to point out. Now, underpinning a lot of this really is the notion of growth and maintaining growth. Growth is perhaps one of the more fundamental things to addressing a lot of these problems: poverty, unemployment, and so on. And interestingly enough, what we have noticed is that, or what has occurred in 2015, is that for the first time in a very long time, the average per capita GDP of Caribbean countries was exceeded by the world average. And again, I think that this is something that we need to, you know, be a little bit concerned about. As a matter of fact, my colleague Justin Ram presented yesterday in another forum and highlighted the possibility that by 2050, the Caribbean region, I don't want to be too alarmist, but the Caribbean region could be one of the poorer regions in the world. So this is something that we really need to take cognizance of. More specifically, and again, this was mentioned, the region has really been experiencing low growth as well as volatile growth, and it doesn't seem as though it's about size. Because if you look at the experience, certainly over the last 10 years of other small states, on average, those states have grown at about twice the rate as Caribbean countries, with about half the volatility. So the excuse of size really is not, or doesn't seem to be, the appropriate explanatory factor in the experience of our countries in relation to growth over the last, certainly over the last 10 years. In fact, we would want to suggest that this phenomenon really is related to export concentration. And basically, exports being limited to those related to the exploitation of natural resources, whether it's tourism assets or it is mineral deposits, which in turn really reflects, given the fact that other small countries have managed to generate competitive advantages beyond their natural endowments, probably reflects an inability to create competitiveness among these countries that would then drive and facilitate export diversification. And a lot of this is related to really institutions that, again, create a drag and probably increase the cost of operating in the region, which makes it difficult, if you're going to produce something that can be produced elsewhere, to deliver the good or service at a price that would be below another country. And of course, the whole notion of weak infrastructure, which again helps to create additional costs. So it means that countries become limited to exploiting their natural resources and the exploitation of natural resources that other countries might not have, whether it's white sandy beaches or pristine forests or, as I said, mineral deposits. But the key is that sustained growth and advancement in standards of living depend on the growth of foreign exchange earnings. And I think that this was explored by Delilah and others. So that a downturn in maybe this one or these two sectors that are exporting in the region then results in mandatory adjustment in aggregate demand to avoid foreign exchange depletion, a fall in income, a loss of jobs, and the social dislocation that results from that. So, you know, at the heart of this is really the absence of competitiveness. And let me just touch, I'm going to talk about the infrastructure, but let me just touch on the institutional side, and perhaps the best known and probably only measure of institutions in terms of their impact on the private sector that covers a large number of our countries, which is the ease of doing business rankings. And interestingly, over the last 10 years, well, the 10-year period from 2009 to 2019, what we have seen is that the average ranking of Caribbean countries has fallen from 81 to 126. And I think that, again, this is a source of concern. And this is a very simple idea, but a very important one. I mean, I think we have to appreciate the fact that taking 2 weeks, for example, to clear items in our ports, or a month to register a business, or being burdened by significant profit taxes, or not being able to go through the process of protecting property rights, or you know, having the opportunity to reorganize business in the event of failure, are in fact costs that make our economies less competitive in relation to other countries. For example, you know, we can think about the Singapores of this world, Mauritius, other small economies that are benefiting from diversification, export diversification, by virtue of having competitive institutions that contain costs and allow them to deliver goods and services at a reasonably competitive price. So this is a very, to my mind, a very important, you know, a very important phenomenon. We talked about debt. Dave mentioned it. He talked about the threshold. the Caribbean specific threshold, which is about 55, 57%, the more globally recognized threshold, which is about 60%. Either way you cut it, we have either 11 or 13 countries that are above that threshold. And the reason why this creates a drag on growth is because obviously it makes investors, potential investors, jittery. If you are about to invest or contemplating investment in a country with a debt to GDP ratio in excess of 60%, or let's say for argument's sake, it's 120%, obviously, as a prospective investor, you are concerned that the adjustment that is necessary to eventually rein in this level of debt could completely alter your profit profile. So it acts as a disincentive to investment. And when debt starts to reach the heady heights of 100%, government is also dedicating significant resources to just service the legacy of bad policy, rather than investing in development expenditures. So this is the basis of the drag to which Dave and others have made reference. Very quickly, youth unemployment is a challenge as well. Wasted resources. 1 in every 4 of our young people are unemployed. And the way that it stands, that 1 of 4 is more likely to be female. Crime, again, disincentive to investment or increased costs. We were talking about this at the lunch table today. The fact that crime, in fact, creates a cost in terms of mitigating for producers. Vulnerability to natural disasters. The Caribbean is in terms of frequency 7 times more affected than larger states, and in terms of the damage and losses, 6 times more affected than larger states, and even more affected to the tune of about 25% than small states. Alrighty, so this idea has already been, I think this idea has been emphasized enough. Small open economies with no reserve currencies, really the key is that growth must be export-led, and those exports must be diverse to prevent volatility and the exposure to the vagaries of 1 or 2 sectors. And in that regard, increased competitiveness is key. Dave mentioned the whole notion of targeting growth rates above the 2%, and in fact, we are saying that there should be a minimum probably of 4 to 5%. And the imperatives in that regard include improved governance. Ultimately, you want to make sure that your political class is held accountable. Improved infrastructure, which we're going to talk a little bit about. Improved resilience, given the susceptibility to natural disasters. Improved regulatory frameworks, we touched on that when we talked about the doing business indicators. Improve PFM systems so that you generate better outcomes and you do so at value for money. Relentless implementation. Very often the principal agent problem prevents incentives to implementation, and there are ways, of course, that have been developed to address the impact of those principal agent problems, and exploiting regional integration to benefit from the size. So, the role of infrastructure in the development process, very quickly, and of course, I'll talk a little bit about regional needs as well. I think the ideas here are fairly obvious. There's a positive relationship between growth and infrastructure, whether it's long-term increases in productivity or short-term Keynesian type impacts on growth. there's quite a bit of evidence in the literature that substantiates this. I thought I'd identify these particular 4 strands. First, the multiplier effects of infrastructure spending on growth, the contribution to long-term growth via its impact on productivity, the effective use on infrastructure, and I guess the institutional values that can be created. Effective use of infrastructure on income inequality, for example, greater access to healthcare, to education, regional development that results from infrastructure, from large infrastructure projects. This chart here just examines the positive relationship between electricity consumption and growth, to zoom in on one aspect of of infrastructure. The literature suggests that for low-income countries, causality runs from electricity to growth, while for more advanced economies, the converse is true. So I guess we are somewhere in the middle. But the story is that electricity costs are high in the region, and contributes adversely to low competitiveness in the region. And this is something that we need to address as we contemplate not only ways of financing infrastructure, but the type of infrastructure that we finance, perhaps alternative modes of generating power, such as solar, hydro, and so on. Let me just run over this one. Road infrastructure is not bad in the region, although there's significant congestion on the roads, and there's the whole question of resilience of the infrastructure, the road network. But generally speaking, the Caribbean compares favorably, and the same is true in relation to water and sanitation, although there's a huge problem in relation to non-revenue water. And of course, the reason why that's a large problem is that you're spending resources, providing potable water, that then doesn't make it to the consumer and doesn't create revenue, and thus has an impact on the financial performance of the utilities. So that's a challenge. In 2014, the bank commissioned a study on economic infrastructure gaps in the Caribbean and estimated that the gap for the period 2015 to 2025 was around $21.4 billion. More than half of this is related to Haiti, but at any rate, there's some significant infrastructure gaps in the region, which is the headline of the study, especially in areas of electricity, which is the major one, water and sanitation. As I said, transport is, although in need of upgrade, is not bad in the region. And we did a business as usual estimate, which pretty much used historical spending to estimate what spending will occur in the future in relation to infrastructure from government budgets. And what we recognize is that about 50% of the gap will be covered with 50% of the need, will be covered during the period from the government's budget. So that leaves a gap of about 9 million. And this is just public sector. So what role can the MDBs perform in seeking to address or help to address some of these gaps. As I said, the gap is 50%. Obviously, some of the gap can be financed from just improving operations. Improving economic management systems means that you end up prioritizing and selecting the more important infrastructure expenditures. Improved implementation and management of public sector investment also helps to create better value for money. You are producing faster at a lower cost, so that leaves a saving to engage in additional expenditures. But also, some of the things that have to be contemplated are non-traditional modes of financing infrastructure, as well as access to climate funding. So the support that MDBs are providing and will continue to provide include improvements in public finance management systems that pretty much improves outcomes and improves value for money. When you do things like improve budgetary systems, as I implied earlier, you pretty much ensure that priority investments are undertaken. You improve procurement systems, you ensure that you get good value for money. Capacity building for better management of public infrastructure is also critical. And the MDBs have been doing some of that through training and through technical assistance. What is also critical is provision of technical expertise in support of design and implementation. So things like climate screening to make sure that the best designs that are appropriate for the region in which we operate and the risk attendant in operating in this region are actually, utilized. That's critical. Obviously, traditional loans for infrastructure development, capacity building for management of public-private partnership arrangements, because it's critical that if PPPs are going to be used to help to finance some of this gap, then the institutional arrangements exist in government. Mobilizing resources to subsidize climate resilience designs. This is, again, something that certainly CDB has been doing, finding resources to incentivize the use of more resilient or rather approaches that create more resilient infrastructure. Participation in PPP deals. Underwriting risks associated with geothermal exploration. Geothermal is a real possibility in the region, given our geography, but there are high costs and high risk associated with exploration. So what entities like CDB have been doing is pretty much underwriting exploration and mitigating those risks through, through grants and so on. Facilitating access to Green Climate Fund, CDB and others are accredited by Green Climate Fund, and we're going through the whole process of assisting countries in designing for Green Climate Fund access, which are grant resources, moving very slowly, but largely because of the agenda that's associated with such financing. We're also trying to deal with the whole notion of implementation capacity. Very often countries have very good plans that are implemented very slowly or very poorly. And I mentioned the whole notion of the principal agent problem that affects adversely implementation. We have been working with a process referred to commonly as deliverology, to assist in speeding up the whole notion of implementation. And I see the chair has been looking at his watch, so let me just speed through this quickly. Trying to address the whole notion of low implementation. But after all of that, what we have to recognize is that traditional procurement can result in poor value for money for various reasons. Poor design, I mentioned construction costs, overruns, and fiscal constraints, and so on. One of the really important options is PPPs. I have here a list of some of the notable PPP successes in the region and what they've managed to, the successes that they've managed to generate. And there are numerous PPP opportunities in the region, including conventional energy, renewable energy, toll roads, airports, ports, water and sanitation, cruise ship terminals, and so on. But what has to be done is that you have to make sure that you have a good enabling environment that includes clear support from the highest levels, PPP expertise and experience on all stages, robust regulations, policies and procedures, as well as funding for preparation costs. And those things would make PPPs fairly a good option. A lot of this is just, patting ourselves on the back, CDB, so I won't go through it. This is the last slide here. Just to note one of the things that we've been doing, addressing the whole notion of the impact of climate change on farming through some irrigation project in Jamaica. And this is very important to the whole notion of growth, and in fact the experience that Jamaica has been having over the last few years. Irrigation has the potential to really close the gap in relation to exploiting the huge potential of the agricultural sector in Jamaica, having dealt with the issues of structural reforms that have been implemented since 2013, as well as the infrastructure, the other infrastructure that has been put in place. So let me just end it there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ian. I think we have some time for some comments or questions. So I want to open the floor. Yes?
Good afternoon, and thanks again to the panel for fantastic presentations. My name is Major Richard Lynch. I'm a retired military professional. More importantly, I'm the Deputy Director of International Affairs at the Ministry of National Security here in Trinidad. I make that statement because I'm certain that I'm not as school in development as many of you all are, but what it gives me is a unique perspective through which I listened to the presentations today. Having said that, I want to kick off by just asking Dr. Siratan to, if you could provide me with a little clarity on your position that the FATCA arrangements, obligations, as well as our AML-CFT arrangements, are de-incentivizing to foreign direct investment if we take into consideration the strategic objective of it is to actually create a more transparent system of doing business with Trinidad and Tobago. The second point that I wanted to ask for some clarity on, for the day, I've not heard anything about the informal economy that operates in the region, particularly in the context of the narco economy and some of its drivers, particularly if we consider the notion that some of the investors in the informal economy that narco and otherwise, are also investing in legitimate or formal economies in the region, and to what extent they may be subsidizing some of the industries to the extent that true competitiveness might not necessarily be reflected unless you understand the impact of these informal economies. The third issue, I heard several references to climate change, which is one aspect of the new multidimensionality of security in the region that has a direct impact on development and competitiveness. And I was wondering if there was perhaps an attempt to look at some other aspects of the multidimensionality of our security reality in the region as it pertains to its nexus or correlation with development. And lastly, the question of judicial and legislative reform to ensure that we treat with the issue of the high levels of incarceration for persons who, during their most productive years, are incarcerated to the extent that when you match that with the rate of the brain drain, the same cohort seems to be either incarcerated or leaving the region. And I think the competition to keep our most precious assets here, human capital, needs to be looked at in the duality of how they fall out of the system, either migrating or incarcerated. And in that context, I think it's important for us to, which is not something we've done in the security sector, and I mean, I would imagine in the development sector as well, and that is to make a study of why those who do very well in the informal economy are diversified and resilient and innovative enough to handle things like the shocks of 2009, the global financial breakdown, and so on. Those who control the narco economy have not lost their levels of competitiveness because of the financial fallout. So we in the security sector have begun to look at the question. Of course, there are moral implications of sitting down with somebody who is not on the right side of the law, but there's, in my field, in war, you need to learn faster than your enemies if you want to win the battle. So just thought I'd throw those comments out there, and I await the responses of the panel.
Yeah, very, very interesting set of issues. What I want to do is take a few more questions, comments, and then I will turn it to the panelists, and they would respond as appropriate. Okay, Arnold, then the gentleman in the back.
Yes, you know, everybody can hear. We talk about the modernization of the public sector, to use a phrase, for greater efficiency, improved service delivery, and so on, which we all agree is vital to enhancing the competitive basis and overall efficiency, making us more attractive for investment. That's clearly a goal I think that we are all agreed on. The issue is the transition from where we are to where we want to go. I don't want to understate how challenging this is going to be. Because on the one hand, you have significant implications for the levels of employment in the public sector, which we agree will have to be reduced as skills and technology take over the management of many of our paper-based systems, and we have electronic-based systems with higher quality people working there and so on. But then we have a lot of labor that we are going to lose that way, or get displaced, so to speak. The implied or the implications for public expenditure are quite significant, because you're talking about, one, investing in strengthening institutions through technological improvement and improved skills persons, and then at the same time, either retraining or accommodating significant losses of persons coming out of the public sector. In a strongly growing economy, these people can get absorbed into other sectors of the economy. So I think the rubber hits the road when we kind of sort of put pen to paper to get an idea in each of these countries what is the size of the adjustment we're talking about here in terms of the modernization of the public sector. And while we are doing that, that task is made easier if the economic growth rates in these countries grow up to allow sectors to absorb. I just wanted to get people's views about the difficulty of this task. My own feeling is that, well, I think we all agree we have no choice. I don't think it's a matter of if we do it or don't do it. But I think it becomes a lot easier, well, not a lot easier. I think it becomes perhaps more palatable to the countries in the region if the region as a group of countries decided that this is something they all had to do, go at different phases and different sequences, rather than individual countries doing it on their own, which most of us have to do anyway. But I think a regional approach to this, because, you know, my final point is that investor sentiment, or the sentiment of the international investing in community, is something that's difficult to model or empiricize on. But one of the things we do know is regions of the world attract investment when the region becomes is seen to be attractive. If you have 14 countries in CARICOM, one country is doing particularly well in terms of its institutional frameworks and so on. The neighborhood could constrain them. You know, it's like a friend of mine say, you're trying to build a condo in the middle of the projects. You know, so having a region that is seen as having a more hospitable environment is helpful. I think that's one of the cases I put out there for maybe a regional approach.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Good afternoon to the panel. I have two points to make. The first is, in his presentation, Dr. Siratan made mention of the paucity of funding available to SMEs in the region. And I wanted to add to that that this is particularly so for those that are operating in the service sector. And in particular, I can speak to this from personal experience, where you approach financial institutions who are quite willing to lend money for you to buy property, but to make to have an increased working capital line as basic as that for a software development company whose software the bank itself was using in its operations, and they don't want to hear from you. So to me, there's a complete disconnect between what the national priorities are in terms of economic development as it relates to the service sector and the creative sector, and what is actually taking place operationally when you actually go out and you're dealing with the formal financial system. The second point I wanted to make is in regard to the question as to the modernization of the civil service. And one of the things that I have not heard anyone address is the critical need, not just in terms of applying the technology, but it's really also the question of change management that needs to go on with that. There are many, many examples where the technology has been put in place, etc. But because that critical change management aspect wasn't properly addressed, the overall project failed. And this is not just in instances where, like in licensing, where people actually were trying to sabotage the change, but just a failure to understand that when you are changing people's jobs and you have the fears that the technology will displace the workers, there are some very real issues that have to be addressed. And if you fail to do that, you will not find success.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me invite David. Looks like you're the man. Or Dilal, you want to come in first? Dilal? You still there, Dilal? No. Do we still have Dr. Earl? Yeah, okay, sorry. Now I see. The modernization of the public sector.
Yes, I have to wait until your people unmute me. Yes, no, I am happy to deal. I think that Arnold raises a very crucial point. That is that the image of the Caribbean cannot be improved by just one country. It is a Caribbean-wide problem. But I want to suggest that somebody has to make a start. And in fact, I have made a concrete proposal with respect to Barbados, which addresses the problem. And so the situation is that the Barbados public sector needs a complete makeover. I have suggested, and my guesstimates really, there can't be more than that, are that would reduce employment in the public service by about 15%. But I've suggested that since this has to be a medium-term program, that you do it over a period of 3 years, and that every single one of those being separated from the public service would receive a tailored severance package. And I don't want to go into the details of what that package might contain, but if you go on my website, I have several pieces on which I talk about some of the things that would be included in there. What that would do is, there is at least $1 billion US dollars of investment which has been in the pipeline. Some of it has actually disappeared over time for the last number of years. The only reason that it hasn't taken place is because of some aspect of the non-performance of our public sector. And so the makeover that I have in mind, simply by bringing the public service up to a competitive international standard of performance, would unlock roughly $1 billion of investment, public and private investment. What it would also do is that it would replace the people that we have now with people who understand how you actually can strategize for development. My principal example is in the area of renewable energy. We now know, with technical studies that have been done with international expertise, that Barbados can generate all the power that it uses from renewable sources of energy, wind, solar, and biofuels, with appropriate eco-friendly storage. We also have studies that have been done to show us what are the alternative mixes and paths to get there. What we do not have, and what government seems unaware of its need to provide, what the public sector cannot provide us with, is a roadmap that everybody in Barbados can understand what the potential and what the issues are, and can buy into the strategy. So the government claims that it has a strategy, but actually, if you look into it and you examine the things that they do and the documents that they put out and so on, it is not actually an implementable strategy. It is not something that you can actually, the public as a whole doesn't have a clue as to what it is that they're getting at. So there's no national consensus. And you can't have a strategy in which everybody has to participate in unless people understand. And then there is no roadmap, there's no action plan, there's nothing that you can tell whether you are actually making progress towards this strategy. So I'm saying that, in summary, that by undertaking and a combination of releasing of the investment that is in the system, plus the development of an entirely new import substituting sector of major dimension in the form of the renewables would actually double our potential growth rate. Our potential growth rate, simply from the release of pent-up investment, should probably be about 2.5 to 3%. With renewables, that could go to 5 to 6%. And that would provide the growth potential for absorbing the labor that you need, plus the kinds of policies that Dylan was talking about this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. One point I would add in relation to this exchange between yourself and Arnold. First of all, I appreciate the fact that you have tried to prepare a detailed proposal in relation to the modernization issue for Barbados. On the transition matter, I would say we also ought not to underestimate the extent to which individuals made redundant or displaced will actually on their own find meaningful ways of employment. I mean, our peoples have reacted to external shocks in many creative and economically beneficial ways than the shocks of the 1970s, the debt crisis, or even some of the structural adjustment programs. People have done that. And so we should not think that it is for governments entirely to provide for the transition. Dave?
Okay. Richard's point about the MLCFT regulations and the potentially negative impact it could have on remittances, not FDI remittances, was the fact that this is based on the whole de-risking phenomenon. So, for example, there are countries that are in complete compliance with the MLCFT regulations. But because correspondent banks, who are the intermediaries between our local banks and the international financial system, they are making a risk-reward judgment about whether the potential of having some infraction in a jurisdiction that does not generate sufficient revenue to warrant that potential risk. They are simply choosing either to limit the interface with those jurisdictions or particular counterparties, or they are simply not agreeing to continue the correspondent banking relation. And in terms of remittances, the reason I mention remittances is because these wire transfer like operations, those are entities where if you are a launderer, might be a prime mechanism to use for everything. So the international enforcement agencies and people who are involved in preventing these kinds of activities obviously focus on those things. But there's another point I want to make, and that goes back to the whole perverse impact that the AML-CFT laws have had on Trinidad and Tobago, because it wasn't the intention of the international community to debank large sections of the developing world or in the Caribbean, right? Because that clearly is not going to be useful to anyone. But it speaks to the whole issue about the effectiveness of regulation. And there's a theory of regulation. And to summarize, basically, if you pitch regulation at a level that incentivizes evasion or avoidance, then you're going to create problems in actually get into your objective. So, for example, the very high penalties we have for driving infractions in Trinidad and Tobago, for example. Some of my American friends were amazed at the level, at the size of the penalties. If you set those things at a high level, that incentivizes people. If you have to pay an $8,000 fine to try to get around it, either by bribing the police officer or some other mechanism, right? So to me, it goes about, it speaks to the issue about how to pitch regulation at a level that maximizes and ensures that you achieve the objective it was originally intended to. To me, the factor AML, CFT, standards and so on have been set at a level which causes all kind of perverse problems that was never the intention of the initial framework of legislation. So it is about design.
But isn't it also part of the problem that, because I've looked at the compliance of Caribbean countries with a lot of these requirements, and what I saw when the de-risking problem first arose is a history of not meeting the standards, not complying, or governments not doing what they were supposed to do and sometimes had committed to do. So that I think we have to be fairly realistic, and when I think of that aspect of it, I then begin to think of other areas and wonder whether we don't have a generalized problem of not addressing the issues we're supposed to address and doing the things we're supposed to do. I'll come to you and then
Yes,
President
I'm glad you raised that, Prof, because it speaks to the broader challenge that we have, which is you locate or you design regulations within the framework of the strength of the institutions to implement it. And it informs a narrative that has been in my mind listening to all of the presentations today, and that is, I've heard several comparisons to other small island developing states in other regions, Singapore and so on. But to what extent in their development, they pursue development ahead of democracy, as opposed to what seems to be the way other countries have approached it. And that is to the extent that one person decides, well, listen, these are the institutions that are going to be strengthened under my leadership, and we will decide who will be elected after me. But while I'm here, and for the length of time that I'm here, these are the sectors that will be developed, and there's no competition or no contrasting views to that. It may have led to certain institutions being stronger than others, while in other regions that's not the way we've gone about this whole question of development.
Okay. Winston, before you come in, and before I forget, this issue of the link between, say, narco trafficking or other criminality and legitimate businesses, I think is a very important one as well. You raise a tremendously important point. In several countries, this country recently, there's been discussion about whether, in fact, criminals are not being legitimized through their participation in legitimate activities. And I think this is important because I remember when in the Jamaican case of Dudus, which turned the city of Kingston and maybe the whole country upside down for quite a while. And I was president of the CDB, and I got a phone call from someone in Jamaica asking whether the CDB had provided Dudus with funds, whether we had made a loan to Dudus or something like that. And I said, no, of course not. What it turned out is that the CDB had made a grant to the government of Jamaica to do certain community things, civil works, and the government of Jamaica had contracted Dudus. So in a way, one has to be careful about the nexus between criminal activities and legitimate activities. And it's all part of the money laundering thing as well. Okay? Winston.
Thank you, Professor Vaughan. First of all, I think I must share Mr. Lean's introduction of the relationship between security and development, something we seem to have missed. Thanks for that introduction. I hope we can correct that with some in-depth analysis later on. I just have two small questions that to solicit a comment from Elvia, first of all, on her very superb presentation. She talked about the access to capital for small Caribbean countries. And I was wondering if you would like to give a brief comment on the relationship between that issue and the issue of the so-called blacklisting of Caribbean countries by institutions like the Financial Action Task Force and other bodies that on themselves decide who are complying and who are not complying with best practices in this area. If there's any comment you wish to make on that. It has always bothered me about the methodology that these bodies have used. The second question has to do with a somewhat provocative statement made by Ian. I think it is in reference to Mr. Ram's presentation that by 2050, the Caribbean countries might find themselves in the lowest level of the poverty countries in the world. And I was wondering if you wish to elaborate a bit on that, because it kind of provoked me a bit that this conference here today is more than timely, if in fact that is so.
Okay. Elvia.
Well, my whole presentation, we had this focus that was on external funding, no, for the company. That I think your question has, you're asking about best roles, best examples to follow. And I think that the whole idea with the discussion of the access to debt security, debt markets, is that this is a small source of funding, but with new instruments, you actually can get to finance new projects that actually can follow good practices overall. Now, for example, most of the green bonds that have been issued in Latin America and the Caribbean, they are issued to finance projects, for example, in water and sanitation is one of them. This morning, I think Dylan talked about green, what's the green economy, you know, and most of those projects, they are finance several different kinds of projects, not only environment. No? You have water and sanitation. You have some of projects that were financed that they were related with women's initiative in Chile, for example. They financed women that are entrepreneurs, all using those kind of financial instruments. No? And I think what you mentioned about best practices also, it's very important, you know, for the countries of the Caribbean also to see what kind of practices, and even the private sector as well here, what kind of best practices you see in the global market and follow. I think I've heard you mention also in this, again, in this line of those financial instruments. Now, since 2016, the second half of 2016, you started to use a more broader definition of what is a green bond or green financing. And they are issuing now what they called sustainability bonds. Sometimes that it's a combination of investment in projects that are environmentally sound in water and sanitation, green infrastructure, but also with social goals. So sometimes, you know, targeting, you know, vulnerable groups and vulnerable parts of the population. And you have also an increase in issuance of social bonds. One of them is the one that I just mentioned about initiatives, like gender initiatives. In Chile, it was one, I think the Banco Estado, it's their state-owned bank, they actually issued a bond to finance programs that would incentivize women's entrepreneurship. So that's, I think those are interesting points to look at. And also it's important to keep in mind to follow the best practices around the world in other countries, other small economies, and as an example for the Caribbean region.
All right, thank you. Ian? The slide into the bottom tier of poverty countries.
Yeah, so I'm going to deal with that very controversial revelation in a bit. But I just wanted to say that, you know, just to piggyback on the point that was made about, or is being made about the modernization, the need for the modernization of the private sector, started by Arnold. The thing about it is that, you know, public sector modernization has been postponed, when in fact, this is something that should have been done incrementally and constantly. And by postponing it, it has made the need even more urgent. I spoke to the, I put up a slide there with the doing business indicators. And what you have to appreciate is that a lot of that really is about the nuts and bolts of public sector modernization, whether it is clearing goods through the port, or whether it is access to you know, things like electricity, whether it is registering businesses. All of these things are related in some form or fashion to the public sector, and the rate at which they work really relates to or is affected by the absence of modern you know, public sector processes. But the thing about it is that there needs to be, to my mind, a systematic approach to this. You're going to have to do it regardless. But there needs to be a systematic approach which incorporates highlighting some of the key areas where, you know, you really need to modernize, where you can get maximum bang for buck, including digitization, including, importantly, business process redesign, and also the whole notion of change management that was mentioned. But these things absolutely have to be done, because as it stands now, they're creating a drag on growth. And if you don't do them, if you instead try to protect employment, public sector employment, then you're being myopic, because ultimately you're imperiling employment in the future. So you really have to, this thing really has to be addressed. Now, Arnold also mentioned the whole notion of retraining. And in fact, modernization, especially if it's large public sector modernization, has to be accompanied by things like retraining, things like providing support for entrepreneurs, whether it's access to finance, you know, management, marketing, etc. But these things have to be, the approach has to be systematic, and it has to be comprehensive, because that's the only way you're going to mitigate the fallout. But you can't, well, you can postpone it, but you're just making things worse if you do. So the whole notion of the relatively slow growth of the country, of the region, we have looked at this in a systematic way. You know, the thing about it though is that there are some small states that are growing rapidly, and obviously we expect those rates to slow. So, you know, there may be some room to alter some of the assumptions. But the point is that the Caribbean is the slowest growing region in the world. Forget small states. The Caribbean is the slowest growing region in the world. At 2%, it's growing slowly. And this is why, as was indicated, in 2015, the world average overtook for the first time the Caribbean average. Now, if this continues, with regions like Sub-Saharan Africa growing 5.5%, countries like Ethiopia being one of the fastest growing economies in the world, although Guyana is slated to take over next year. Rwanda, countries that are really, really forging ahead in terms of undertaking structural reforms and building infrastructure with the help of all sorts of partners, MDBs, bilaterals like China, etc. If this continues and we continue in the region to, to try to protect employment in the short term and not pay attention to infrastructure and so on, then you can very well see in 30 years at the existing rates, the region would pretty much be at the bottom of the pile. So it may be a little bit alarmist, but I see it more as a call to action for our, our decision makers to prioritize the things that need to be done to advance growth in the region, including the structural reforms that are necessary, including the infrastructure upgrade, especially our ports, basically our logistics network, period. So roads, but you can't continue, we can't continue in the way that we're going and escape the possibility of falling to the bottom of the pile.
Okay. Well, let me try and bring this session to a close. I know the schedule ended at 5, we have gone over quite a bit. It seems to me that throughout the day, we have a convergence of findings on the nature of the development problem, economic growth problem, and what are the obstacles to growth. There are different emphases in the sessions earlier today and even this afternoon. And obviously there are some hanging questions or points at which we might have further issue, like for instance, the question of the decline in official development assistance and why that is so. Is it simply a matter of graduation on the basis of income criteria, or could it also be the diminished geopolitical significance of the region, or the change in balance in security concerns across the world, which then tilt the aid package and orientation of the major aid donors in one direction, rather in a direction different from the Caribbean? The question of remittances, and well, particularly Dave's point about, well, even the dominance of private capital flows. Now, I'm not sure what dominance means in this context, in a context where the total flows have fallen as well. Total flows are smaller. So the ones that keep up might look very large, and you use the word dominance, but what you're really dealing with is the underlying problem of weak flows. Dave talks about putting greater emphasis on domestic financing. But Delisle would argue, probably in response to that, that domestic financing, and I'm going to put it diplomatically now, domestic financing needs to be calibrated with foreign exchange earnings, because for every domestic dollar spent, local currency dollar spent, there's a foreign exchange component. Well, we've dealt with Ian's questions about the infrastructure gap, which I think is important. I'm less sanguine about the extent to which the 50% to be financed by government is realistic. Less sanguine about that, but it's an estimate. But when I consider a lot of these things overall, that's a kind of heretic thought. That if we look at the correlation between the ease of doing business rankings of the Caribbean, we look at the trend in credit ratings, we look at the trend or where we stand in the world, or ranks in terms of tertiary enrollment rates, and we look at quite a few other indicators, and if we look at even where we stand in relation to West Indian cricket. You wonder if there is not a more a systematic problem, maybe what Carl calls culture, but which I think really, in essence, if you look at it from an action point of view, is a problem of decision making and the quality of decision making. Peter Gantum today, this morning, spoke about the evidence-based approach of businessmen in making decisions. And I would say also the process and the time factor, that adherence to time. When I contrast that with the government sector, and particularly with the political directorate of the region, I see, first of all, a tendency to not to be bothered by empirical evidence. Secondly, a tendency not to make decisions on a timely basis. And thirdly, a tendency not to implement the decisions made. And this is a recurrent problem. And unless we address those kinds of issues, whether in private lives or in public lives, I think we are really not going to make much headway in tackling the growth and development issues. So that might be a good point for which some libation, perhaps. I think we're invited to a reception. Yes, so we're ready for it? Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much, colleagues, for a very good day of discussions and for enduring to this point. We meet again tomorrow.